Hello, everybody, and welcome to the June North Central Climate Collaborative webinar. We are pleased to have Liam Bean here from the Montana State University. I don't know if it's like Ohio where you have to add the in front of Montana State, probably not. But I am glad you're with us. This meeting is being recorded. There will be a poll that will pop up at the conclusion of the presentation. And we believe we've left plenty of time for questions. So as you have those questions, go ahead and enter them in the chat. We'd hate for you to forget your question. And we will make sure we get them all answered afterwards. So with that, I'll invite Liam to unmute, introduce himself, and begin his presentation.
Oh, how's it going, everybody? I'm definitely going to steal that. I will now be only going the Montana State University. My name is Liam Bean. I'm a master's student with the People Places Water Lab. We're really excited to present some of this work today. It's about volunteer water monitoring programs, which is something I'm always really excited about. I love science education and use in data. And with that, I'd like to just kind of get right into it and start talking about volunteer water monitoring in the context of Montana and sort of some of these complex work nets that have evolved out of it. Oh, just going to share my screen real quick. And we'll go into presentation mode.
Looks good.
So just really quickly, can everybody see the screen all right?
You're good.
Okie doke. Again, everybody, my name is Liam. This is work that I have been doing with my advisor, Dr. Sarah Church, and alongside Dr. Adam Siegler, who is part of our water quality extensions at Montana State. My working title for this is kind of the power and perils of partnership, and it's pulled from one of the chapters of my thesis work, and it's an ANT approach to studying volunteer water monitoring programs in Montana, especially as they relate to data use and legitimacy. And so ANT is actor network theory, and I'm sure a lot of us have heard that running around, but for those of us who are less familiar, I'll kind of define what I'm taking from the theory a little bit later on in this presentation. So just a little bit context about Montana, because again, we are outside of the North Central region. Montana is a headwaters state, right? Most of us at some point in our lifetime, even if we didn't live there, have drank water that started in Montana. And while we have an immense amount of stream miles, half of them are not meeting our quality standards for their intended uses. And this is deriving mostly from non-point source pollution, and a lot of that is likely ag. Because of this, because we're a headwater state, because we're an ag state, because we're a water state, rivers are really important here, right? River runs through it and all that. We have over 36 water monitoring programs. This was our last count, volunteer programs in Montana, and it's one of our key tools for water resource protection. But it does yield benefits beyond simple data collection, especially for volunteers and the communities that these programs are situated in. This research was guided kind of by these two overarching questions, and I'm really only going to look at one today. That was, how does information diffuse from water volunteers to their communities, to people around them, to their friends, to their families, to their coworkers? How do they take what they've learned and spread it around? The other question was, what is the role of volunteer monitoring programs in information legitimacy, in governments, in data-driven decision-making in Montana? And like I said, today, I'm really going to focus on that second question. We're going to deal a lot with legitimacy, data, how it gets used. So how do we go about studying these programs? We developed 5 comparative case studies across the state. These are comparative because these cases have a lot in common, but like so much different context. All of these programs are relatively mature. Each of them have at least 10 years of data, although that's not always continuous in the same locations. The Sun River Watershed Program has actually been gathering data for 20 years. These programs are diverse in their geographic location across the state. So they're kind of almost like a shotgun scatter, mostly concentrated in the south of the state, as our populations in the north are really, really low. Mussel shell is kind of a unique example. It's north central, and all of these watersheds are dramatically different. They have different livelihoods. Some are ag, some are tourism, and they have a very different volunteer base. All of these programs are riparian programs, although some are the sister programs of lake programs, like the Sealy Lake Adopt Stream. We really wanted to only be comparing riparian programs, so we're sort of removing a different element from that if we were looking at both riparian and lake programs. The primary method of data collection was interviews. There's over 27 interviews that we have collected. 2 are with state agency staff, 2 are with utility staff from our power utilities, 2 are with our extensions professionals, 9 are with program managers, 12 are with volunteers. Now, one of the issues with that volunteer box is a lot of those volunteers are also decision makers of some kind. They're also data users. Some of them were local mayors. Some of them were also state agency staff at different agencies. So it's interesting how the volunteers kind of bleed into some of these other categories, but this is kind of how we broke down our interview structure, and we had slightly different guides based off of people's roles, really to just focus in on what they were doing. After these interviews were collected, they were analyzed in vivo and put in the context of these cases. And some of that case context comes from direct observation, it comes from the interviews, and a little bit of document analysis that we're beginning. So one of the theories that I really want to focus on today is this model of trust when it comes to knowledge systems for data-driven decision-making in sustainability and ecology. It focuses on 3 elements of trust. And the center element, credibility, if something is credible, is often where our brains want trust to end. I wish that this is how it worked. I wish that only the adequacy of evidence was the key thing that gets folks to use your data. But it's a lot more complicated than that. One of the other kind of compounding factors is saliency. A lot of the times, folks don't assume that information is relevant to them or important to their decision making. A lot of the times it isn't. Most data is insalient to most decisions we make, but a lot of the times there's a salience problem of what we assume to be salient and what is salient. So if people assume something is salient, they're more likely to trust it. They're more likely to use it as part of their development, as part of their decision making. Legitimacy is the third kind of key piece of this triangle from this Cash et al. Framework. And legitimacy is if the process is a fair and inclusive process. It's more of an affective form of trust. It's more of, hey, I like the people doing it. I have the chance to participate. I don't feel separated and a barrier between me and the other people. I feel they're legitimate. They have the ability to get this data, and I believe that they should and can get this data, which is very different than credibility of, are you doing it right? Legitimacy is much more, should you be doing it? Is this the way we should be doing it? I think this is the way we should be doing it, right? And these all kind of bleed into each other and really do lead to, will we use data to make a decision? But there's an elephant in the room that I want to quickly address. And that is, of course, yeah, we all wish that just if everyone was rational all the time and we just were able to process all the data streams and make the best decisions about which was collected, which went to a validated lab, right? If we had all of that information, people just knew the science better, we would make better decisions. That's the deficit model of science education. That's the deficit model of science communication. And while it has a lure, it's beautiful, it seems simple and like it should always work, it doesn't. We're so much more complicated than that our use of this information is often confounded by those other factors, that legitimacy, that saliency, or even just as other people like Kahan have suggested, just our worldview and how things affect our worldview is going to change how we look at data. So there's a lot more going into this than just say, if we knew the science better, we would make better science decisions. So the last little piece of theory I'm going to bring in is how I analyze this data. In vivo, I did a qualitative analysis, but I did an ant-inspired qualitative analysis. That the method of this study, actor network theory, was studying a worknet or a network. Now I'm going to use worknet because I like funny words, but the idea being of a worknet versus a network is, in a network, you're studying networks. The network is your object of study. In actor network theory, the network is our method, not our object of study. So many of us use the term worknet to focus on the work being done between those nodes of the network, not the network itself. So what are the nodes of the network? And the key nodes are the actors. The actors are the most important thing. Now, anything can be an actor in a network. This glass of water right here is an actor in a network. In fact, it is an actor in a water monitoring network. There are so many actors. Actors can be theories and concepts. Oftentimes, actors are black boxes. Black boxes are just the things in a system that we don't necessarily take for granted, but we don't need to investigate them. My computer is a black box. I'm working in PowerPoint. I'm not an electrical engineer, and I'm not a computer programmer. I know enough of that theory to kind of understand how it's working, but I can run PowerPoint and it works. It's a black box. So I'm not taking it for granted, but I don't need to unpack it. Black boxes in science are often things like really classic theories or core understandings of disciplines. Actors are kind of enrolled and follow programs. We think of programs almost like the programs that computers run, right? We group together, we work to accomplish something. I'll talk about what that something is in a second, but these programs are built of actors following scripts. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of scripts. I won't need to define them, but just know that when I'm studying this stuff, I'm looking at how the actors are contributing to programs by following scripts. Now, the volunteer water monitoring programs, we could think of them as actors. We could analyze them as independent actors, but here we're looking at them as programs of all of these actors together, following these scripts to create something. And what's the point of the program is to resolve controversy. Controversy isn't necessarily just a big, bold political opinion or anything like that. A controversy is any time where the information is unsettled, where the truth is out, right? We deal with controversies all the time. A really good example of a controversy is a lake impaired or is a lake not impaired, right? Is a stream disturbed? Is a stream not disturbed, right? Montanans brag about our undisturbed stream miles, but that's still controversy. Programs work to provide some result, like they want to black box that controversy. They want to take it and they want to settle it. Well, other people are also trying to settle that same controversy. And they're anti-programs. They're not necessarily working opposed in enmity to our programs. They're not necessarily our enemies, but they're certainly working parallel to the programs to create a different solution to the controversy, right? We can think about this as two labs, both studying the same problem, but using slightly different methodologies. They might converge and settle the controversy the same way, or they might settle it totally differently. And then we have to wait for everyone else to valorize how those two different labs as research programs approach the problem. That's what we're seeing here. The programs are working to solve the controversy, usually something surrounding water quality. Anti-programs are also working to solve that controversy. In all of these cases, there are programs and there are anti-programs. The anti, again, not necessarily enmity, but they're working to solve the controversy differently. All of this that I'm talking about the WorkNet, this is my description, which is still a script. So I'm still feeding you all a script, right? I'm still feeding you something for a program, something to accomplish something. It's just a description. So again, this is kind of the theory getting a little meta of my description of the theory and of these processes is still part of a different WorkNet. So that is something to take for, to consider as we're sitting here talking, that my perspective on this and my experience with this is still my description. It's carrying a lot of value and other actors in the WorkNet working together to influence that. And the last thing I want to talk about really quickly before we get into our analysis is what were historical barriers to data sharing in other networks. And I mean here networks, not WorkNets, and other, literally the shale network in Pennsylvania. What did people find to be the key barriers? Well, researchers have found that in the context of Pennsylvania, dramatically different than Montana, that some of the barriers were the credibility of volunteer water monitors being called into question, regularly their credibility, is there enough evidence to support that you are doing this work correctly, was called into question. Resource allocation was a significant issue. Access to funding for these programs. They had barriers to funding that they couldn't access. Different actors were competing for funding, depriving each other, putting them in competition, which prevents sharing. If we're all competing with each other, we don't want to work together necessarily. If I get the federal dollar and you don't, you're not going to want to work with me later, potentially. And then legislation, which is there's sometimes just legal barriers written into the law. You can't use data that haven't been collected by a state agency, or you can't use data that haven't been collected by a validated lab. That's really common in a lot of places. And again, this is not the context of Montana. This is the context of Pennsylvania. These are what other researchers have found. And we're kind of trying to see, hey, are these barriers, are they the same ones present here when it comes to how we use data? Well, no, that's the short answer. But what we found is through this network analysis process is that a lot of these volunteer water monitoring programs had really similar trajectories and histories. And that the slight differences in them, in their trajectories and their paths, led to large differences in how data were being used. So I want to just take you quickly through a sample program history. And then I want you to understand that this is what I've looked at for all the other 5 programs. We just don't have the time to look at all 5 histories today. But here's like a history from the Madison Stream Team. So the Madison Stream Team began as a program of the Madison Conservation District in response to them noting that many of our tributaries that locals really like and consider to be pretty clean and nice streams are listed as impaired by the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Early actors in this are the DEQ, right? They're huge. Their TMDL, total maximum daily load document, that listed the streams as impaired, was big in moving people forward. Our co-PI, Adam Siegler, these was early days for him starting to organize these programs and really work through extension to provide access and funding stuff, was very key in inciting some of these the CD to act. We've got the CD and their program managers, and also the population they serve. We've got Ennis, Montana. For those of you who don't know, Ennis is a tourist town that's very well known for its fishery. They're invested in having clean streams. And the attitude of the people of Ennis is that our water's pretty darn good. All of these actors sort of came together, and out of that was an initial enrollment in which program managers from the Madison CD and extension at Montana State, begin training volunteers, begin just sampling, just starting to sample, starting to monitor, identifying the tributaries that they think maybe shouldn't have been listed or maybe should be listed, and keeping an eye on them. And this goes on for a little bit until it creates 2 kind of camps. We've got a completed program, which was DEQ's monitoring program, that said, hey, these are impaired streams. And we've got a new program, this the Stream Teams program, that's starting to unblack box that, open it up, create a controversy. Now I've included Northwestern Energy in both of these programs because Northwestern Energy was part of both of these programs, both as a funder and as a partner. Northwestern Energy is a power utility across Montana that operates several power dams. Their FERC mandate is pretty strict. They have to follow some pretty strict rules. And Northwestern Energy operates Hebgen Dam, which recently had a pretty significant failure in Ennis, Montana, outside of Ennis. And as part of their mandate, they heavily monitor everything that comes in and out of Hebgen, all of the tribs, not all the tribs, all the main stem. They heavily monitor the main stem of the Madison as it comes out and into Hebgen and in and around Ennis. So there's tons of main stem monitoring being done by this program. So the reason that they're enrolled with both the Stream Teams program and this DEQ program is because it allows the Stream Team to go, hey, Northwestern is doing this, we can just monitor tributaries and really expand our network. So already, even in this initial phase, we're seeing that partnerships are coming together, which is a common trend in resource management in Montana. We're heavily reliant on collaboration. But something shifts. A new TMDL process is starting for the Madison, and DEQ is looking for partners. Now, the program managers, and again, co-PI, Adam Siegler, are like, hey, this is our chance. We are trying to get our data used. We want this opportunity. We have access, we're training volunteers. We can go out there and participate in this process. And they start a process of partnership and collaboration with DEQ, and they end up creating a DEQ Northwestern Stream Team program all together, working to pursue these TMDLs. And that creates a direct path for them for their data to be used to address that initial question. Now the Stream Team contributes to the controversy to answering the question, are these streams impaired? They've been able to get a lot of agency and power. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, total maximum daily load documents are produced mostly by state governments for the federal EPA. And I always say that they describe the worst day on our stream, right? They're the worst day. And they're extremely important for making governance decisions, but often are non-regulatory or non-binding documents in these places. So the stream team hasn't really gained regulatory power and that kind of governance power, but they do have the ability to work together with these organizations to settle some controversies. And that's really, really important to them. And they actually successfully complete the TMDL process. The CD is mentioned many times. Their data are used. It's part of the TMDL. They're in the acknowledgements. They're like, we acknowledge the help of these program managers, right? The program is almost finished, but a new program manager has been introduced in the last few years of the life cycle, and they start to reflect back on what the program is doing and what the program could continue to do. And now the program actually enters a new phase 2 that looks a little different, and they're still figuring out who they are. But what I wanted to do by sharing this history, one is talk about where the role of the different actors are, right? Talk about this enrollment, re-enrollment process that's not a straight line, right? It's not, if they produce good science will happen. It's very much a process of governance, collaboration. There's complex things happening. But also, in 4 out of our 5 cases, this exact process was followed. And in the 5th case, they're just really only on step 2. So in all of these cases, we see the same pattern. We see the same moves. We see an inciting incident begins the program, an initial enrollment where the program decides what they're about, what they're going to study, who the anti-programs are, where the anti-programs are, what they're doing, what controversies are they gonna, what things are they gonna unblack box and make controversy. Then we see a period of re-enrollment. Almost all of the programs, something happens that they get re-enrolled. A new program forms. I think that's pretty unique to the context of Montana. Now, the 4th thing is this evaluation phase, usually caused by leadership change, but sometimes the completion of the program. Sometimes the program is just done. And that phase leads to an evaluation that usually cycles back to a new enrollment. And the reason why I don't think of this as a re-enrollment, as a recreation, is because oftentimes, like what's happening in Madison, the form of the program is now so distinct from its initial form that it looks like a new initial enrollment. It looks like we're finding a new mission, we're finding a new cause. We haven't been re-enrolled in our mission, we're finding a new purpose. I think that this process of re-enrollment and collaboration and working on the fly, which is really ingrained in Montana governance, is what makes our context so unique. And this is the partnership that introduces incredible path to governance for these programs. Like in the Madison case, they were able to directly contribute to a document. So I just want to go back to remember these data barriers from Pennsylvania: credibility, resource allocation, and legislation. Well, when you work with the state, when you enroll together in larger programs, there's still, your credibility is still called, right? A lot of our state level actors are saying things like, well, I think sometimes the volunteer monitoring programs aren't the most, or the volunteers make mistakes, or we don't trust them when they start, but once they get going and get training, then we start to work with them. Things like that come up. We don't want people going out with mason jars who don't have sampling analysis plans. But because of this enrollment process, enrolling with both MSU, with our extension, and enrolling with the state, these programs gain a lot of credibility. They have sampling analysis plans. They have yearly training, reliable training. We also don't have a resource allocation problem because, one, there's not that many resources to allocate. We have a resource scarcity problem. But when we have these great partnerships, there's so much resources being shared around between that partnership, right? DEQ is funding, they are funding the stream team. Northwestern is funding the stream team. We see this example over and over. DEQ through extensions, they funnel money through extension to these programs, right? Because of this, the resource allocation is less of a, I get mine, you don't get yours. It becomes more of a, we are using the resources we have to work together. And I think this is, the re-enrollment partnership is what has made these things not barriers in Montana, but barriers in other places to having our data used. And our data get used a lot. Another one of our programs, the Gallatin Stream Team, located in Bozeman, very associated with the university, has been used many, many times in the development of Gallatin County and City of Bozeman plans as part of their water monitoring. And this re-enrollment, they'll often be very flexible. They'll move around. They will react. If it's suddenly like, hey, we're looking for human waste contaminant, they'll start testing different things, which actually they did find in Sourdough Creek. Sorry for those of us who are tuning in from Bozeman, if you didn't know that. But legislation provides the largest barrier that maintains between these two cases. Legislation is pretty rough in Montana about what can get used, and it's changing. The legislature has been doing some really interesting things. I'm not going to get into that right now. But historically, we've had really, really, really strict standards about what can and can't be used. And this is really, really common between us and Pennsylvania. So I just wanted to talk about legitimacy. Legitimacy is the thing that is being formed by these partnerships, right? Water monitoring partnerships would help with this information and program legitimacy. Here's a quote from the stream team. Part of the reason the Conservation District got involved with the TMDL was because there were folks in the community saying they couldn't trust DEQ or the state. They wanted someone vetted in the community actually helping with the monitoring effort. If we have community members working to monitor, the state becomes more legitimate. Here's DEQ. If there's local partnerships that are engaging landowners and the organization that is helping support the monitoring is more trusted by the local landowners, and if we're coordinating with the organization, it helps. It helps private landowner anxiety about government coming in and doing work. So if we can shoulder to shoulder, that's better than top down. Here we see, right, it helps state legitimacy. So in the eyes of the program, it just helps state legitimacy. It legitimizes them and allows their data to be used and allows work to flow easier. It really helps perceptions about water management, influences how the state can monitor and how the community can contribute to and accept water quality data and plans. So we see this just big, it's like everybody wins. Legitimacy and partnership are really driving out those two common barriers that were identified in Pennsylvania. Love this quote. We took programmatic money, same amount of budget, less travel, more of it went to sampling, less of our staff had resources. We looked at all the data, we looked at theirs, we looked at ours, everything lined up well. You think about the landowners sitting in the audience. It's not just DEQ that saw this, there's community consensus. This is DEQ talking about the process they did in Madison with the TMDLs that drove consensus and really allowed it gave the Conservation District things that they were saying to landowners legitimacy, and it gave DEQ legitimacy in the eyes of those landowners because their friends and neighbors had been part of this governance process. So we've still got legislation barriers in Montana. A really good example, a different DEQ staff member said, like I said earlier, you asked if there's data I trust. Well, there's data I can legally use and there's data I can't. It doesn't matter, right? The political will of our legislature really controls how our agencies can make decisions and their power. And this is a barrier everywhere in the United States. This is unique to no one. We're all looking at this, we're all going, oh yeah, I'm somewhere, somehow our legislator has done something that has restricted how we can use data to drive decisions. But a unique one in Montana is saliency. So all this process of re-enrollment really changes what monitoring programs are often collecting. Sometimes what the landowners originally wanted to have collected doesn't end up being the final product. And on top of that, water quality just isn't that salient in Montana. Sounds really weird. Water quality is super important. It's important to the health of our watersheds. It's important to ag, but we have a lot of really good water here. And as one stream team volunteer noted, as long as it's good enough for the cow to drink or to go to the pivot, a rancher doesn't really care what the quality looks like. There's obviously some degree, like you don't want radioactive water flowing through your stuff, but it's a lesser degree. Quality is not thought of as the first thing. So we're producing all of this quality data, and a lot of the ranchers in most of these regions really want quantity information. They're actually afraid that the quality information can then hurt them. Now, there's one exception in these 5 cases, and that is the mussel shell. So the mussel shell has a unique geology, is very, very saline, and they have a high salinity water. Whenever there's a flood year, it resalinates, and it salinates their stock ponds. They're really, really suffering from a crisis of there's just parts of the year where if it's running low, if there's a low quality quantity year, cows can't drink it because of how saline the water is. So ranchers constantly are reflexively using that data as it comes in. And we can see that where quality data are salient, they get used aggressively to drive local decision-making. Every day, ranchers are checking the salinity levels. They're bothering the volunteers. They're saying, hey, can you check my stock pond for me? Like, I know you're not supposed to. Can you check my stock pond with your YSI meter? They're very, very, very engaged because it's salient. In a lot of these other communities, it's thought of like data for science, data for later, data for other people, not data for us. And it becomes less salient. They're less engaged. They're less likely to use it. And it takes away some of that local governing power that maybe it could have had. What's the last one? This is a fun word, right? You got to kind of come up with your fun names for things. And that's data purgatory. So we collect data en masse in Montana. There's so much data, but it's waiting to be valorized for trend analysis. And I want to talk through this a little bit, which is that we just have huge storehouses of data that are just having small errors corrected so that they can be used for 10-year trend analyses. And that's good science. That's really great science, right? Having 10 years for our model, that's good. Having 20 years, like in the Sun River, that's really good. And this is a result of the strong enrollment with Montana State, but also with University of Montana. Going to confuse y'all real quick. And all of our little other schools associated with those 2 systems. And a lot of the programs, because of this heavy enrollment, have decided that trend analysis is one of their goals. We are producing data for trend analysis. We're really going to try and monitor the same sites as much as possible, collect the same metrics for 10 years, get that data to MSU, let them clean it and analyze it. And that's great science. It's going to, in the end, it's going to tell us so much about these watersheds. But it's a saliency problem. It takes a long time. This process of revalorization, of cleaning, of analysis, it takes a long time. It's insalient. Some of the community members don't really get it or want to get it. They're more like, what can you tell me about my water today and now, and less concerned about the long-term monitoring. Doesn't mean that those 2 things are bad, right? They're both good. They're both important. The process of this revalorization of this data sitting for years is good science, right? It's okay governance. It could be better governance. Now, this is a quote I'm pulling talking about this, and it's in context, and I have it removed from the context right now. And the context is talking about this data valorization process. And this is a program manager saying, a lot of monitoring isn't common sense conservation. And a lot of it, to be frank, is just gathering data for data's sake and feeling good about it, but not translating it into something meaningful. And this process of waiting to translate it into something meaningful can really affect volunteers negatively and communities negatively. They need both things. We need the quick feedback and the good science process. This really makes us question, what is the point of these programs? When 3 out of our 5 put long-term trend analysis as one of their primary goals, background monitoring and trend analysis are primary goals of 3 out of our 5 programs, what is the purpose of the program? Right? Are they an extension of scientific institutions, or are they for these communities to govern and make conservation decisions? And if we want it to be the latter, we still need the former, but we need to balance them just a little bit better. These are both good things, and they're both happening, right? I'm trying not to be super pessimistic, but there's a lot of discussion about how long it's taking to do these analyses and how if they're collecting these, again, in salient data, these long-term analyses, can they use them in management decisions? So I talked about a lot of different things. I was all over the map. So what are kind of bringing it back? What are these core takeaways about these volunteer water monitoring programs in Montana? Well, they're complex work nets. They're a real mess to get into. And actually, full disclosure, when I started this research, I thought it was going to be a much simpler question of, hey, where there are programs, people are going to use data more, people are going to like data. And I had a really, again, back to that thing I said earlier, a really mindset of the deficit model. People have the education, they have the access, they have the ability, they will use data. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. But these work nets are full of collaboration, they're full of re-enrollment, they're full of changing our goals to make sure that we can do something with this data. And it provides a path towards doing things. So this collaboration, this re-enrollment provides a path for these programs to have governing power. Partnership leads to legitimacy. So that's our big thing. This is surprising no one. Involving people creates legitimacy, right? The legitimacy helps address some of those credibility problems, but it doesn't just create legitimacy for the programs in the eyes of the state. It also creates legitimacy for the state in the eyes of the community, right? By working shoulder to shoulder instead of top down, DEQ becomes slightly more legitimate. Now, some research done by other people in the People Places Water Lab is showing that there's still a lot of hesitancy towards DEQ and towards DNRC, our Department of Natural Resource Conservation, in many of these communities to work together. But the DEQ managers and DNRC managing staff are really seeing their role as shoulder-to-shoulder partners, not as top-down controllers. And that's a really good step towards this legitimacy construction. And finally, shocking nobody, barriers are unique in Montana. Montana is a unique place. Our barriers to the use of data are very, very different than other people's barriers. We actually have, this is going to sound a little condescending, but an incredibly well-educated populace. People in Montana are more likely to have an advanced degree. You can look at the demographics. People know how to use data. They're familiar with it. If they're not doing it, there's other reasons why. The deficit model really fails here. And again, I propose that those are because of saliency issues, simply that landowners often are more afraid of quality data or just don't care because quantity is so much more important, especially in these immense drought years in the West. And the data purgatory, or just the time it takes to valorize data and use it for decision making, especially when we enroll so much with research institutions, also is a barrier. Now, I just want to close. I think that purgatory barrier is the membranous one. It eventually gets overcome. The saliency barriers and the legislation barriers, they can be permanent. They can be walls that just stop data from getting used and allow data to sit. But once it gets valorized by someone like COPI, Adam Siegler, got to mention Adam a lot. He's key in the WorkNet. But once it gets valorized by his office, by his staff, and they start using it, it now is in use again. So data purgatory is a membrane. It's a place that data passes through. And while it's passing through it, it's really uncomfortable. When it gets to the other side, it is good. I think that's all I have for you today. And I think I tried to come in at 35 minutes, and I think I came in at 37. So I'm ready to move on to questions if we're there.
All right. Thank you, Liam. I'm going to administer a poll here in just a minute, but please do go to the chat, enter any questions you may have. My initial question to get you started out, Liam, is you've got these volunteer monitoring networks and data is important. Have you seen any of the networks that you've looked at make any small or large scale changes to practices as a result of the data that they acquire?
Oh, absolutely. Most of these programs are administered by CDs or programs that parallel CDs, foundations, or water quality districts. So conservation districts and water quality districts are really, really involved in this. And oftentimes they will use their data to identify sites for remediation. They will target landowners. They'll say, hey, this would be a good site for remediation. And then combined with local knowledge, so combined with like the manager's knowledge of like, hey, which landowners are interested in conservation, which landowners are doing this. And like Jack Crick, actually, I think it was more Crick, is really vulnerable. Let's target landowners along here and see if we can engage them in a remediation project. Now, volunteers also directly use the data to drive change, which is really fascinating. And would have, if we focus more on the volunteer diffusion component, that's something that really occurs there, including in Sealy Lake. Volunteers led activism against, disassociated from their program, using the data they collected. They led an activist process against the construction of a new gravel pit, because Sea Lake already has a gravel pit, a new gravel pit that would in fact impact one of the key tributaries that runs right through one of their subdivisions. So both volunteers and programs are using this to drive conservation action on the ground, which is really, really wonderful.
Excellent. We've got the poll open, so please participate if you see it. And Rachel asks in the chat, why do you propose landowners fear quality data?
Well, I would say that there's definitely a component of mistrust for any regulating actor, right? Anyone who has regulatory authority or power to come down and turn off your tap, or say, hey, you are over, like, we're going to fine you, you're over contributing. So there's this idea of, especially, and in all 5 of our work nets that I talked about today, or draw on from today, this is less so than in some others. A case that I have also looked at, not as in depth, is Paradise Valley. I think that's in a lot of our brains. I really hate that that's the place in our brains from Yellowstone, the really awful TV show. But in that case, there is a fear that our tap will be turned off, that our way of doing things is threatened. And in fact, a lot of the volunteers in more of these rural communities are also the ditch riders, right? They're going along and they have direct access to shutting you off of the community ditches if you're over pulling. So I think that there's a fear of that too, of like, maybe they'll take action. It's really a fear of action of, I will be targeted because I'm potentially contributing to this problem. They're very aware that there's an issue.
All right. Do want to just highlight the fact that may not be scientific consensus that Yellowstone is an awful TV show.
Oh yeah, I think there's definitely some grumbliness of, like, if you lived in Bozeman, of like, oh, Bozeman.
We do have another question in the chat. Pollution permit holders often are required to monitor and report their own pollution. In the non-point context, do you get a sense that farmers, ranchers, or other non-point source polluters also want to be involved personally in monitoring, or should they be?
I'm going to say yes and yes, especially again in those. We looked at different contexts across Montana, and it's always hard for me to justify and say that, like, we looked at a rural program, we looked at an urban program, when our urban areas never really crack 100,000. But we in those more rural and remote areas, like the Muscle Shell, so many of the people engaged are engaged in ag. They're really engaged in ag, and they're, again, it's the community ditch rider. It is the farmer, it is the rancher, because in those places that's super, super salient to them. I've noticed in the programs where they are a slightly more urban context or a more resort context, there's less involvement. But when landowners do get involved, oftentimes they start to address and remediate problems that happen in the Madison CD. So yes, producers and polluters are involved in the process. And yes, I think they should be. They do have an advocacy and bias, but so does an activist, right? We're all coming from an advocate perspective, and part of the way that these programs operate is really to manage and both legitimize and manage both of those advocate perspectives, I think. I know probably too much of a weird answer, but yes, yes, and yes.
Before we go to the next question, I did want to pull back to the beginning. It was brought to my attention that last week, Ohio State University did get to trademark the, but only for merchandise purposes. We are still allowed to make fun of the verbally. All right. What pollutants do the TMDLs address where volunteer data are used? Is there anything beyond bacteria?
Oh yeah. So one really important one again. I always go to the mussel shell because it's one of my favorite ones. They're looking for specific salts, which isn't necessarily a pollutant, but that's a huge metric they're collecting, and it can be from some of the runoff. Obviously, yeah, bacteria, nitrates, dissolved oxygen. Oh gosh. Sometimes there's just like conductivity measurements too. Yeah, bacteria and bacteria and actually algae are less in a lot of our systems. Our water context is a little bit different. Yeah, but generally they're broadly collecting a pretty wide range of metrics. Different programs will collect different things. For example, like I said, in the Galveston, they were looking for bacteria, but most of these programs really aren't. They're kind of in the begin and end sometimes at conductivity and dissolved oxygen.
Okay. Next question in the chat. Have there been cases where volunteer data was used to list water bodies on the state's 303D? And what's a 303D for those who might not know?
I also struggle with 303Ds, so I'm gonna dodge the question a little bit and say that for pretty much anything like that, they avoid them. But I'm gonna dodge and pass it. I struggle with remembering exactly which is the listing. I know I'm supposed to be the, but sometimes you don't have the answer.
Fair enough. Well, certainly not against the idea of giving folks back a few minutes of their time today. And I don't see anything new in the chat. So I do want to thank everybody for filling out that poll. I want to thank Liam for speaking with us today. Very interesting topic with a lot of complexity, and appreciate your attempt to wrap your head around all that. In 2 months for the August webinar, we interestingly have speakers lined up from The Ohio State University to share with us a little bit more about, I believe it's climate change adaptation in an agricultural landscape. But we'll be getting that information out for people to register within the next few weeks. This meeting has been recorded and will be posted to the North Central Climate Collaborative website within a week or two. And with that, have a great day, everyone.